There we go. I'm on now. Sorry about that. But be thinking about Creason. Be thinking about Mr. Creason. Anyway, how old is he? Is he a young fella, elderly, older? 60s? Okay. All right. So fairly young then. Fairly young. So be remembering him. The largest religious painting in the world is 195 feet wide by 45 feet tall. It was painted by Jan Stuyka. It was a picture of the crucifixion. It's a massive panoramic picture. It came over to the 1904 World's Fair, which was in St. Louis at that time, but when it got to the docks, when it got to America, there was a disagreement about who would pay for the customs, who would pay for the taxes, who would store the painting. The World's Fair at that time didn't have a building large enough to house it or to frame it or to display it. So for about the next 50 years, it is wrapped up and almost lost, almost forgotten about, till one day in the basement of a Chicago Arts Museum, a guy stumbles upon it. It had been wrapped around a telephone pole and stored in that basement for nearly 50 years. Well, upon finding the painting, there was still the issue. Where will we house it? Where will we display it? It just so happened, of all places, a cemetery in Hollywood called and said, we will build a building large enough to house this painting of the crucifixion. Now, this cemetery in Hollywood is, I guess, where a lot of famous actors, actresses have been buried. They built this building to house this picture of the crucifixion, and then there's also a large painting of the Last Supper and a large painting of the resurrection as well in this one building. So they built this to house this one particular painting, and through this one particular painting you get a picture of the crucifixion according to Jan Stuyka. But when you look at the Old Testament, if you want to see a picture of the crucifixion, there's several places you can look that the crucifixion is portrayed. One of the places that you would look at it from the Father's view is Genesis 22. Now, if you're in the New Testament, you would look at the Gospels, and the Gospels would portray the crucifixion from Christ's point of view. But if you wanted to look at the crucifixion from the Father's point of view, you would go to Genesis 22, and you would need to look at Abraham and Isaac. You would view it from their perspective. Now, in chapter 22, many theologians say that this chapter is almost written with a cadence, with a rhythm to it. And if you have the King James Version in your hand and looking at it, you will notice that almost every verse starts with "and." You will notice the word and, just repeated throughout this chapter, and it almost has a rhythm that goes to it. So let's look at verse 1, chapter 22. Now it came about after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, Here I am. After these things, what things? Abraham has been through a lot of tests. Now, maybe you feel that way today. Maybe that's where you are today. You say, I have been through one test after another in my life. You're going through a time of testing maybe right now in your life. You need to know that God allows His people, His children at times to go through some tests. He allows us to do that to see if we will trust Him. Will we trust Him as Jehovah Jireh? Will we trust Him as the Lord who provides? Will we trust Him to provide for us in all things? So verse 1, after these things, that's where Abraham was. He had been tested time and time again. Some of the tests he had even failed. After all these things, Abraham had been tested. One of the tests he had, if you look at chapter 11, Abraham had been tested with a family test. He was instructed to leave his family. He did that. He left the family. Then you move into the famine test. Abraham failed at this. He didn't allow God to provide for him in this way. During the time of the famine, Abraham retreats, goes down to Egypt. Then there's the test between him and Lot. Their cattle, their herds are growing. There's not enough room for them to be together. They have to separate. They have to depart each other's fellowship. And what happens? Lot takes the better land. So there's a test there. Then you have the test of Lot being captured. Lot and his clan, his group of people. His community, they're captured, they're taken prisoner. Abraham has to build this army, has to take his people to go rescue Lot. That was a test. Then you have a test that Abraham comes against the king of Sodom. The king of Sodom had offered him wealth, had offered him money, had offered him just precious jewels, had offered to make him somebody, I guess. And Abraham basically says, I wouldn't even take a shoestring from you. I wouldn't take the strap on the sandals on your feet. He wouldn't have anything to do with it. So Abraham responds correctly to that test. Then comes this test in 22. He's going to have a child at the age of 100. He's promised to have this child, and at the age of 100, and in chapter 21, he already has Ishmael, but now Isaac is going to be born to him, and Sarah doesn't want to have Ishmael around anymore. She doesn't want to have Hagar around anymore. She says, Abraham, send them away. I want my son Isaac to inherit it all. Look at chapter 21, verse 12. But God said to Abraham, do not be distressed. So Sarah has, I want you to remove, I want you to get rid of this. Do not be distressed because of the lad and your maid. Whatever Sarah tells you, listen to her. For through Isaac your descendants shall be named. Now Abraham probably loved Ishmael. Why wouldn't he? It was his child. It was his son. Now Sarah is content against Ishmael, but Abraham probably loves him, treasures him. And Sarah is going to say, remove this son. Get rid of him because there's this division. I want my son Isaac to have it all. And God tells Abraham, do what the lady says. Verse 13 and 14 and 21. And of the son of the maid I will make a nation also, because he is your descendant. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar, putting them on her shoulder, and gave her the boy and sent her away. And she departed and wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. So the first thing you see here is that there is only one way to the Father. Now who's the Father? Abraham is the Father. There are not multiple ways to the Father. This is a parallel right here. Ishmael is a large community, is a large religion right now. But that is not the way to the Father. You are not going to get an inheritance from the Father by being a part of Ishmael. It's Isaac. Isaac is the way to the Father. So that's what we see right here. There are not multiple ways. There's only one way to the Father. But through all of these tests, through this test of Ishmael, through sending Ishmael off, equipping him, God's promises to him about Ishmael, Abraham's faith is growing. Even if a little at a time, a little by a little, his faith is growing. God is planting these building blocks. I've seen it in my life. Been in struggles, been in hard times, been in valleys, and little at a time, only because we've gone through valleys are we equipped to go through future things. Are we equipped to put more of our faith in God because we have gone through certain valleys before? So Abraham's faith is growing. God is building his faith. Now, for us, if you're being tested, don't be discouraged. If you're being tested, don't be discouraged, but be encouraged. We can take that from Abraham's life here. So now Abraham is at this incredible test. If chapter 21 wasn't bad enough, sending your son Ishmael away, chapter 22 is going to be terrible. The worst thing ever. You wouldn't wish this on your enemy. Nobody would go through this. Nobody would do this. But now Abraham comes to a point where he has to completely trust God as Jehovah Jireh, the Lord who provides. Here's the first thing. Can you trust God with your most valuable possession? Abraham moves from one test to another. That's a lot like the Christian life, isn't it? It's a lot like our life. It seems like every few months there's a test that comes our way. There's maybe a crisis. Maybe you have a crisis at work. Maybe you have a crisis or a test with a family, with your spouse, with the kids. Maybe there's a crisis or a test with a sickness. Maybe there's a crisis with depression or finances. It seems like that is just the routine, the cycle that we're in. Every few months it seems like there's a new test that we go through. So Abraham is in a test, and how can we trust God with even our most valuable possession? Abraham was probably one of the wealthiest people in the land at that time, even in the world at that time. Is a very wealthy man. Now, what is his prized possession? What has Abraham been looking for his whole life? Abraham's whole thing was, I need to have male heirs to inherit what I have. And what does he have now? He has one son, Isaac, left to inherit the whole thing. God's going to build a nation, a kingdom. God's going to bring his people from this right here. And he's promised that to Abraham. So this has got to be his one most valuable, treasured possession. Can he trust God with it? Back to chapter 22, verse 2. God comes to him and he says, now take your son, your only son, whom you love, your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you. Now, do you see how specific this is? There's a lot of parallels between Isaac and Christ. Your son, your one son, your only son, whom you love. Same thing God said about his own son. His one son, the one whom he loved. And he's going to be an offering. Christ was offered up as an offering for us. Take the one whom you love. Now let me ask you, is there something in your life that you can't do without? Abraham had just had this boy, Isaac, maybe 20 years old at this time. Abraham has had this time with him. He'd probably give everything else that he owned or possessed to keep his one son, to keep him safe. Is there anything in your life that you think you can't live without? Look at Lot's wife. Lot's wife couldn't live without Sodom. She turned back. She couldn't live without that society. She couldn't live without her social status. She couldn't live without her lifestyle. God wants to know, do you love the God that gives gifts, or do you just love the gifts God gives? Do you love the God that gives gifts, or do you just love the gifts God gives? He wants to know, can you trust him with your most valuable possession? Can you trust him with everything you have? What can be your most valuable possession? For Abraham, it was Isaac. How many parents worship their kids? How many grandparents worship their grandkids? A kid can become your most valuable possession, and they are mine. I love my kids. I love my wife. I love my family. But can I trust God in all things? Can I trust God with my family? Some of you maybe love your social status. Some of you maybe love the things that you have. Some of you maybe love the image that you project onto other people. And you say, I can't live without projecting a certain image on somebody else by what I wear, what I do, the way I act, the places I go. Can you trust God with your greatest possessions? The second thing, can you trust God when his plans don't make sense? Verse 3. So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son. And he split wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of God, a place of which God had told him. Now, why didn't Abraham bargain? Why didn't Abraham negotiate? Hey, God, you know, I've got some cattle. I'll give you all the cattle I have. I'll give you all the sheep, all the goats. I'll give you all this over here. But just leave Isaac alone. Just leave my son alone. God, can we work this out? Is there a payment plan? Is there some installments? Can we break this down? God, are you sure? God, I think you've made a mistake here. Remember, you said I would become the father of a nation. And if you're going to take my son away from me, I'll have nothing left. God, I think you've made an error here. But he doesn't. He doesn't ask. He doesn't ask why. He doesn't say anything. But what does Abraham do? He responds in obedience in his life. Now I wonder as they were walking, what did they talk about? They're going to walk for 3 days. As Abraham and Isaac, as they were walking, what did they talk about? I wonder if Abraham showed him how to track animals. Showed him what track. This is a deer track. This is a rabbit track. This is whatever tracks they have over there where they live. This is what these tracks look like. I wonder if Abraham took Isaac and he said, hey, there are times you'll walk between the mountains and there won't be anything to drink, and you'll be between wells, or you'll be out here in the wilderness and you won't have anything to drink, and this is how you can find water. Let me show you. I've been around a day or two. I can show you how to find water in these areas. Maybe Abraham was showing Isaac how to find food. Here's some good berries. These berries you can't eat. They're poisonous. They're not healthy for you. So maybe he spent time trying to show Isaac how to find water, how to find food, how to track game while they were out here walking around for these 3 days. Probably, look at verse 4, on the third day Abraham raised his eyes and saw the place from a distance which God had told him. Can't you imagine at this time that Abraham has just prayed and prayed and prayed for the last 3 days, his every moment in his thinking, he's thought about his son Isaac, and that God has called him to sacrifice him, and he thinks, God, you've made a mistake. Can't you change your mind? What can we do here? God, take me, not the boy. I'd have to imagine that Abraham was at the point in his life where he was ready to give his own life for his son. God, how about me, not the boy? Surely he thought of something like this. But for 3 days, they have walked. Now on the third day, Abraham raised his eyes and saw the place from a distance. It's not your will, but his. Can you trust God when his plans don't make sense? None of this makes any sense. Here's the third thing. Can you trust God to provide? Verse 5. Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey, and I and the lad will go over there, and we will worship and return to you. Now I sense, maybe it's just me, but I sense confidence building in his voice. He's just made a statement here. We will worship and return to you. He has just decided, possibly in his heart, that God is going to do something. God is about to do something. I don't know what it is. Have you got to that place yet for yourself? When you decide, I can't do it anymore. My social status isn't worth it. What I possess isn't worth it. I'll trust God with everything. I don't have to act that way, look that way, be around that. I'll give it up, God. I'm tired of it. Abraham gets to the point where he says, I'm going to worship God, and we will return to you because I trust God. I don't know what you're going to do, God. You're going to provide one way or the other. You're going to provide through this. I believe you. It doesn't make sense on the outside, but God is going to provide. It doesn't make sense to Abraham on this side of it, but God, you're going to do something. Maybe you're going to resuscitate him. Maybe you're going to heal him. Maybe you're going to touch him. You'll bring him back to life one way or the other. Verse 6 and 7. There seems to be this confidence building. We will return to you. Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So the two of them walked together. 7. Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, my father? And he said, here I am, my son. And he said, behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Then you come to verse 8. Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. So the two of them walked on together. God will provide, Jehovah Jireh. In Hebrew, it means to see. That provide means to see. Maybe in the footnotes or the side or the margin of your Bible, it shows that as well. Provide means to see, right? That God sees for himself our needs is what that means. Can you find comfort in knowing today that God sees you and your needs? Abraham was telling Isaac, God sees and will provide. God sees our need. Can you find comfort today knowing that God sees you and he sees your need as well? God will provide. Since he sees, he will provide. Since he sees, he's already made a way. God saw Abraham's need. He sees your need. Verse 9, then they came to the place of which God had told him. And Abraham built the altar there and arranged the wood and bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Now, don't you think by this time Isaac knew what was going on? Abraham is over 100 years old. Isaac is close to 20 possibly. Do you not think that Isaac could have taken Abraham at any time? Isaac could have fled him, could have whooped him, could have ran away from him. Isaac probably could have manhandled him. He was probably a stout young boy entering his prime. But yet in obedience, Isaac follows through with what the Father requested. The Father brought him to something that didn't make sense, but in obedience, Isaac follows through. Christ didn't have to go to the cross, but in obedience to the Father, he followed it all the way through for you and for me. Verse 10. Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. As he's about to slay, as he is about to sacrifice his boy, notice what happens. Verse 11. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham! And he said, here I am. What if Abraham, in verse 5, Abraham has determined we're going to the mountain to worship. What if Abraham we're going to the mountain to go to church? What if Abraham had went to worship that day, went to church that day? What if you had gone to church that day and you had this bitterness in you? What if you had come to church this morning and you have this bitterness in you? You say, well, I'm just going to sit back here. I'm just going to sulk. I'm just going to revel in it. I'm just going to roll in it. I'm just going to have this pity party for me. I'm just going to swell up on the inside. I'm not going to say anything to anybody. I'm just going to be a fuddy-dud. I'm going to sulk. If Abraham had went to church, had went to worship that day with bitterness in him, do you think he would have heard God call out? Or would he have been too focused on his own personal problems? What if Abraham or you had been distracted on that day? Now, we've had some good distractions this day. I'll give Satan that. He's done a good one today. But what if we had been distracted and the message that was brought that day was just for us and God was calling out your name, but you were too distracted to hear it? Now, how about Abraham's son is laying on that altar fixing to be killed? And if Abraham had bitterness in him, if he had been distracted from what God had called him to do, could he have heard God calling out his name to him? But Abraham heard God speak. Verse 12 and 14. Abraham says, here I am. He said, do not stretch out your hand against the lad and do nothing to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Then Abraham raised his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for a burnt offering in the place of his son. Abraham called the name of the place, the Lord will provide. There you go. It's probably got a footnote, Jehovah Jireh. As it is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord it will be provided. Now, you look back at verse 2. Where were they? They're on a mount called Mount Moriah. Now, this is good. You've checked out. Come back. We're almost done. They're in a place called Mount Moriah. I love this. I love it. I told you this is a picture of the crucifixion. If you haven't seen it yet, you're going to see it right here. God leads Abraham and Isaac to a mount called Mount Moriah. We see parallels between Isaac and Christ. What did Isaac do? The wood was tied to Isaac's back. Isaac carried his own wood for his own sacrifice. Christ carried his wood for his sacrifice. An offering is needed to be made. Isaac is laying there, fixing to be killed. God tells Abraham, stop. Abraham has already declared the place the Lord himself will provide. And in that time, Abraham raises up his eyes and he sees but what? But a ram caught in the thicket in the thorns. By how? By his head, by his horns. He is caught in that thicket, in those thorns. It's a picture of a sacrifice that was going to come for us. Isaac, who is willingly led, who is willingly bound to this altar, who is led to be a sacrifice, who carried his own wood. Abraham calls that mount, he himself will provide. And Abraham looks up and he sees that sacrifice, the ram caught over there in his thorns. And in verse 8, he says, this is the place God himself will provide in this place. And about 2,000 years later, on that same chain of mountains, is a mountain called Golgotha, Mount Calvary. Where Christ, where this lamb 2,000 years before was sacrificed for that, and where 2,000 years later Christ himself was the ultimate sacrifice for you and for me. It is the same. Now I can tell you're all just floored. Maybe I didn't do a good job explaining it. But Isaac, 2,000 years before Christ, carried his own cross to that mountain to be a sacrifice. And God said, I myself will provide on this mountain. And he did. He provided his own son. That's glory. That's the picture of the crucifixion from the Father's viewpoint. Can you trust God? Can you trust God with your most valuable possession? Can you trust God when it doesn't make sense? We have a lot to be thankful for. We have a God who loves us, who says, and what you can't do, I will do through my Son. We have a God who gave, who emptied out the treasure chest of heaven for you. Christ left his glory in heaven to come to earth, to be a man without a flaw, to be the sacrifice for the world. That we should be thankful for. Don't discredit it. Don't think there's many ways. Don't think I can live my life like hell and expect there not to be repercussions. He's a just God. We've already decided, we've already read. We are to be separated. We are to be holy like God. Not to look like the world around us. We are called to be different. Can you trust God with your eternity? Let's pray. Maybe somebody